Start now, so if you want to grab a seat, we're going to be talking about decentralization and some censorship resistance. My name's Red. I'm a research analyst at Messari, and I'll let my panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. That's better. I'm Porter. I am a security engineer at Matter Labs, working on ZK Sync.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cooper. I'm technically the head of decentralization at Aztec. We build a privacy-first rollup.
I'm Mike. I work at the Ethereum Foundation on research generally around MEV and some inclusionless stuff. So, yeah.
Great. So before we tell you why you should care about decentralization, we'll give you a rundown on where the space is now with it. So I'll throw this to you first, Cooper. You want to just give a rundown on the general state of decentralization on just Ethereum, not layer 2s?
I think I figured this one out, maybe. Is this working? No? Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, Ethereum has been, one of the most decentralized, credibly neutral projects over the past 8 to 10 years. I think Ethereum's decentralization, credible neutrality, censorship resistance are generally what make it interesting, what makes it a desirable platform for people like me and Porter to build on top of. And I think a lot of the core protocols and primitives that we see today having meaningful adoption share a lot of those same values and properties that make Ethereum interesting. I think that we're still at the early days of this, translating into the layer 2 and layer 3, 4, 5 ecosystems these days. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that throughout the panel.
Yeah, so that's where Ethereum, the base layer, is, but a lot of the building is not really there these days. A lot of it is on L2s. So, Porter, given what Cooper just shared about the base layer, where do L2s stand with their various types of nodes?
And I'll get all the unfortunate things out of the way. So, yeah, we haven't decentralized sequencers. We haven't decentralized provers. Forced inclusion is kind of a work in progress, and withdrawals also is not always completely permissionless. So there are several very important security steps to go still for L2s, and it's all being discussed, and all of it's okay, but when is it actually going to happen? So hopefully soon.
Yeah, Mike, to get you in there, on Ethereum L1, there's still a lot of changes being made. It's definitely not ossified. So what are some of the changes that are going to affect the state of decentralization there? And do those have a direct effect on L2s and their state as well?
Yeah. Wow, this mic is really loud. So I do think the Ethereum L1 is the most decentralized platform we have currently, but there are tons of kind of pressures coming from external forces. There's kind of centralization pressure on the staking layer. There's centralization from MEV. There's kind of all sorts of external pressures that are pushing on the protocol. I think some of the things that are most exciting to me are around censorship resistance and increasing, kind of hardening the protocol. And I think especially stuff like inclusion lists and kind of forced transaction inclusion on the L1 directly translate to L2 benefits, because even if your L2 is getting censored, then the forced transaction inclusion on the L1 needs to be able to go through unencumbered. I think in terms of other big protocol adjustments that kind of support and maintain the solo staking ecosystem, stuff like increasing the max effective balance could potentially lighten the load of running an Ethereum validator. You have stateless clients, that's kind of a follow-on from Verkle trees and the overall retooling of the execution layer clients to make them more lightweight. I think continuing to make all these decisions around preserving solo staking, that kind of credibly neutral backbone of the Ethereum consensus layer is really the design philosophy that I think makes the most sense.
Yeah, and considering we're going to be, try to make some of these changes, keep that neutrality on the base layer. We talked about decentralizing some of these things, or we talked about how we haven't decentralized some of these things with L2s. I'll ask one of our two L2 panelists, what are the steps your protocol is going to take first, because there is a lot of work to do. We got to start somewhere.
I'm not quite sure which one will land first, but we're working on all of them. If you measure by L2 beat, which is great at measuring the decentralization status of all the different rollups, I do think within this year there will be at least one L2 that is all green in terms of fully decentralized. I think the last thing that will happen is the tough stuff around the upgradability on the L1, which if Ethereum keeps changing at the base layer and then L2 wants to stay EVM equivalent, then we also need to change and upgrade And who's in control of those? Probably some sort of security council, and that's going to be the hardest to get rid of eventually.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to Fuel V1, I guess, for being the first stage 3 rollup that existed. Obviously, no one's actually using it, but shout out to the Fuel team. Aztec is a privacy-first protocol, and one of our key design philosophies is being incredibly neutral. So we see day one decentralization as kind of a fundamental requirement for us to launch. And what that means is a fully permissionless sequencing set and a fully permissionless proving set. It should be one of the first L2s that is trying to do both. All of our design has been coordinated in public. So if you go to forum.aztec.network for the past 9 or so months, my major job at Aztec is to facilitate public RFP and design processes for sequencer selection and prover selection. Shout out to Ellie and the Espresso Systems team, honestly, for writing great proposals to both of them. So I'm happy to be here. But we've been building and designing this in public, and you'll see us ship from day one fully decentralized L2. I think Porter brings up the elephant in the room of governance and upgradability. I would say that this is a more difficult challenge than how do you let more nodes in the system participate and stuff. And so I think that that'll be very interesting to see how it evolves. I think Vitalik kind of nicely articulated that even he underestimated the kind of security risks that come with building L2s. And L1s, in a worst case assumption, your consensus network can fall back to a previous state. And L2s with bridged assets and bridged security validation, a lot of times your users can lose money, so it's actually harder to design, safe L2s potentially than L1s. So I think governance minimization will probably be the last of the things that rollups decentralize, and you'll see people adding, various types of node architectures over the next, 12 or 18 months.
Yeah, governance is a messy one. Centralization moves fast, so it's easy to update before you get to that point of decentralization. But definitely the idealist approach. Launch with everything decentralized. I know we are a room full of optimists, and we think we will decentralize everything. Eventually, we'll get there. We'll get it right. What happens if we don't? What is actually the consequence of us, we'll use a centralized sequencer for a while. Something might pop up. Like, what can go wrong?
I guess my general question here is like how much do L2s actually plan on decentralizing? Like, in my mind, the kind of trilemma that has been talked about for a long time is more of a dilemma, right? It's choosing between scalability and decentralization, and it seems like most of the L2s kind of have leaned on the scalability track, and I think that makes sense because like Ethereum provides the decentralization that the L2s then rely on to provide like scale at like a permissionless level. So yeah, I guess I'm not sure exactly how like fully decentralizing the L2s feels like kind of having your cake and eating it too, in a sense. And so it's like Ethereum always will be the most credibly neutral base layer. I think for the L2s, decentralizing is kind of a means to get that censorship resistance property. Like in my mind, that's kind of the whole point of decentralization in the first place, is to have permissionless innovation, permissionless participation in the protocol. So yeah, I guess I'm curious to hear how the L2s plan on doing that. And if I think that's kind of what's at stake. If decentralization is not achieved, then you just have some sort of like censored L2 or a set of censored L2s, which is kind of like maybe the end game, which I don't know, doesn't seem ideal.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of L2s, they would argue that centralized sequencers are, sufficiently censorship resistant as long as you have the ability to force exit or forced withdrawal. And I think as long as you actually can do that from a user's perspective, you're practically probably getting most of the censorship resistance you actually care about, right? They can't steal my money. I think a lot of that, ends up in what we would call like soft censorship. You can't exit for 24 hours. And if something really important happens in those 24 hours before you can force exit, you could get liquidated. The price of that asset could swing 100%. Bad things could happen because a lot of protocols only let you force exit every 24 hours, or some of them might not even let you exit for every 7 days. And so I think centralized L2s are totally fine in a lot of cases if you're not super worried about soft censorship, and you can rely on eventual L1 inclusion within 1 to 7 days. I also think that given Aztec is a privacy protocol, we're much more worried about it than a lot of others. And so I think that, back to your original point, I don't think a lot of L2s ever plan on actually decentralizing. They probably don't want to. It's going to eat into their business model.
Yeah, that's a good point, that L2s by design inherit most of their censorship resistance from the L1. We generally look at what's the total number of nodes as, how decentralized is this network? It's really just one dimension of it. So I'd like to ask if any of you could share some other dimensions or maybe places we should really be focusing when we're trying to measure decentralization of an L1.
And from the security perspective, the goal is to be able to run forever the infinite machine with there's no way that any government can suddenly decide to stop it or anything else. And so it's not just number of nodes, but location, also easiness for an average at-home staker to run the chain. ZK verifiability also helps. And so we want to be something indestructible, moving towards the cypherpunk ethos a little bit. You want to make it so that it's impossible for any one group anywhere in the world to shut this down. And so number of nodes definitely helps, but spread out and easiness to run and other things also help too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Barnaby had a post that he described it as preference entropy, which I think is a really cool way to phrase it, which is, a bunch of people running this software that have different preferences that they can express through the software. So whether that's preference over transactions that get included, preference over the client that you're running or the hardware that you're running on, diversifying over the many different preferences feels important. And yeah, I think geographic decentralization is super important. Phil has this post called "You should be a geographic decentralization maxi," but if we end up with a bunch of data center nodes running in different countries, I don't think that's actually that meaningfully decentralized, because obviously there's kind of a point that everyone can get bottlenecked through for each country if it's run by a large entity or something. So yeah, definitely allowing the individual to sovereignly run their own hardware and software feels like the point that we have to focus on.
Yeah, I think shout out to Sasha at Lido for talking about it very eloquently. I think, would you rather have a network where there's 1 million nodes, but most of them are in the US and Western Europe, or would you rather have 12 of them in countries that really hate each other? Which of those are likely more resilient to geopolitical attacks? And I think that it's an important question to ask, honestly. It's kind of what properties are you looking for out of your system that you're designing? So yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. And I guess a question for you, Mike, to follow up on that is given your obviously stated preference for preserving solo staking, does that include preserving the ability for solo proposing at home, or where does the line of what Ethereum needs to preserve at home kind of end?
Yeah, so I think the end game as kind of presented by Vitalik's roadmap would be you could participate in the consensus layer kind of very simply through stateless clients, where you download a proof that the block is valid, you verify that proof, you sample some data to know that all that data is available given the the distribution of blobs as they're flowing through the network, and then you are able to construct and propose a block locally. Obviously, this is slightly difficult because proposing the block is always going to be the most difficult part. I think my end game is something like the at-home staker is still able to propose some set of transactions, like in an inclusion list, for example, but they don't have to be able to construct the entire block, and they might not even be able to hold the whole block in their state. That could be delegated to the builders and processed through this MEV market that's going to be highly sophisticated actors. But as long as the solo stakers can have some view of the mempool, have some view of the transactions that are trying to get included, and express that they want some set of those transactions in, that seems like probably the end game in my mind.
So even in a post-execution ticket world, solo stakers will still be able to potentially propose at least into an inclusion list of sorts.
Yeah, exactly. They'd at least be able to specify the inclusion list, even if they don't construct the entire block.
That is very interesting. Thanks for entertaining my side quest.
We hinted at some future upgrades there. We talked about a little bit of PBS stuff, but there's one coming much sooner, and that's going to be blob space. So one question I have is, how should L2s behave with blob space? Should there be something like self-limiting, as you suggested, Cooper?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think everyone that's building on or thinking about DA knows that Ethereum's blob space is going to get very crowded very quickly, and with that, the costs will rise. And the core value proposition of proto-dank sharding is reducing the cost of rollups. And so if there's not enough DA, the cost will rise, and there kind of goes the key value proposition. And Aztec as a privacy-first rollup, you're not just sending transactions and signatures to the network, you're actually sending client-side generated zero-knowledge proofs. And so I would say in the spectrum of L2s who may or may not take up a lot of DA, we're probably on one end of the spectrum. And so, yeah, I think it's an important thing to talk about how much of Ethereum's blob space should a DA use. I think we'll end up in conversations kind of like Lido and self-limiting around 33% or something like that. I don't know what the number is, but I think a lot of the L2 should probably start talking about it, because within weeks of 4844 shipping, the costs are going to get pretty expensive, honestly.
I'm sure we can trust everyone to play fair and not use too much. It worked fine with Lido.
Yeah, I don't see any problems happening in that direct analog.
Well, it feels weird to me to try and commit to like limiting the amount of blobs used, because we don't ask L2s to, for example, limit the amount of call data they use today. So like, yeah, I guess
I like this argument.
like it feels like if the blobs are that oversubscribed, then like you said, the 1559 mechanism will just price them such that like they effectively cost the same amount as call data. So is that the end game you expect to happen? Like it just kind of approaches the price of call data immediately?
I do expect blobs to very quickly reach n-1 the price of call data, honestly. I think that there's a lot of unsolved questions in like blob sharing or blob chunking across smaller projects that don't need an entire blob. I saw projects at Istanbul's DevConnect hacking on stuff like that, but I don't think any meaningful L2 is probably going to do that. So yeah, I do think within the next 6 months it'll approach very closely to the price of call data, and honestly every L2 is going to have to implement a fallback feature where if the price of DA is above a certain threshold, you're going to use call data instead.
Yeah, actually this is super interesting. Do you think L2s will have to have like OTC deals with builders to get blobs included?
Isn't this what pre-confirmations are? Is this what blob futures are?
Yeah, I guess. A worst case is just like you go and have a handshake deal with a builder, right?
Yeah, I think that's an inevitable outcome if there's not sufficient infrastructure for people to pay their way into blob space. And so if 1559 works properly for blobs, then it's not necessary potentially. But I think a lot of builders might honestly take a price cut in the short term for exclusive order flow long term. And so I think it'll end up looking a lot like the potential builder ecosystem, honestly, because it'll be the builders at the end of the day deciding which blobs get in or don't.
Yeah, that private mempool as a service is in play right now on Bitcoin with Marathon, and they just posted the largest block ever through their slipstream. So not really that crazy of an idea happening right now somewhere else. Could totally be happening on ETH.
Yeah, if any builders can guarantee Aztec a bunch of blob space, I'd love to talk to you.
Porter, I want to get you back into the convo. So in terms of shared sequencing, what changes or what advantages might that bring for a rollup that maybe hasn't decentralized, their own set of provers or something yet? Where could projects benefit from that?
There's shared sequencing is cool. It's definitely like one option to like better improve the censorship resistance of an L2. There are worries that like it could still be a bottleneck, or that like you sort of lose some control over the L2 if you're trying to like run the whole thing yourselves. And especially as we add like more hyperchains and different stacks, like will we have room? I mean, do we even have blob data? But do we have room through the shared sequencer? And actually, I haven't looked too much into it, so it's possible this is much more solved. But I'm not sure.
I have a quick question. Are all shared sequencers decentralized? Because in my mind, like
They're not.
Okay.
I would say categorically there's probably a difference. I know some shared sequencers have, I would say, very high networking requirements that may require you to run them in data centers. And so it really depends on a case-by-case basis what they're optimizing for on the trade-off space.
Okay, yeah. So I guess when we talk about shared sequencers generally, are people usually referring to shared decentralized sequencers or shared centralized sequencers?
I was thinking, it could be centralized, in which case you're still adding another option. A decentralized set would, get you closer to an L1's node set,
Mike asking the billion-dollar questions over here.
I mean, it just seems like the shared sequencer where you sequence like 10 OP stack rollups or something is going to have like huge requirements, right? Like you have to run all 10 nodes for all the L2s and simulate, like if you want to give pre-comps across all the L2s, that's just going to be like, there's no way that that can be decentralized, right?
Yeah, but I think a good argument could potentially be that even that like shared sequencer, even spread across n data centers, is probably more decentralized than OP's current deployments.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, I'm going to take a pivot and bring us to MEV. So I don't know who wants to jump in, but I'd like to hear a little bit about the current state of MEV, either on ETH or with rollups.
Do you think there's MEV on ZK Sync these days?
As the single sequencer, we do first come first serve. We're not gonna to front run our own users.
I think you'd be surprised by some other protocols.
Oh, okay. Oh, true. All right. So just in the terms of block building, it's just us. But yeah, there's definitely some people who are very clever at extracting money.
Yeah, I guess from Ethereum's perspective, the MEV landscape has evolved quite a lot in the past, like since the merge, obviously. So currently there's about 3 block builders that account for close to 90% of Ethereum blocks. 2 of them are prop trading firms. One of them is Titan, which is kind of a credibly neutral builder. At least that's how they're positioning themselves. So obviously that's not great. I think in general, trying to increase builder competition is something we're thinking a lot about, but it's a very difficult problem because MEV is such a centralizing network effects type thing. I also think that MEV in terms of blobs is something that hasn't been very well explored, especially around timing games. So timing games is this idea that like if you wait longer to do your protocol defined activities, then you extract more MEV because time elapses. There's more time for the price on Binance to divert from the price on Uniswap, etc. And blobs are just like these extra data objects that take time to propagate through the network. So the builder has to decide between like including a blob or maybe waiting an extra few hundred milliseconds and publishing their block a little bit later. So that kind of sets a floor on the price of a blob because they have to pay at least the amount of time that the builder would sacrifice by including that blob in a block. So I think there's a lot to say about MEV. Ethereum's MEV ecosystem has like evolved and will continue to evolve quickly. Relays are starting to play timing games, and yeah, it's kind of the Wild West still, I'd say.
Yeah, I feel like historically builders and the MEV on L1 ecosystem is obviously very profit driven and they're very short term focused. And if there's money to be made today, they're focused on making money today. Blobs aren't here today. They're not worried about making money in 3 weeks. They'll worry about that in 3 weeks. I think that they haven't really spent that much time thinking about it. But in reality, depending on what types of transactions you're actually publishing in blobs, in Aztec's case, we envision a lot of people, making private L1 Uniswap trades or otherwise. L1 builders could front run effectively all of Aztec's users in one swift go because you're doing L1 to L2 comms, and as long as you get your transactions in before the blobs are included, you front one everyone trying to go from L2 to L1 potentially.
Yeah, is there any situation where an L1 builder could use the contents of the blob to make a decision about a transaction that they make on the L2, or would it be the transaction on the L1 that they're able to?
They would not be able to like post hoc change Aztec's block ordering, but
Right.
they could front run an L1 user, or they could perform some type of SexX arb if there's a lot of L2 users going to L1 Uniswap, for instance. So I do think that there will be a lot of money to be made from the builders, especially if there's still only 3 of them in a few months. I think one thing Aztec is talking about or thinking about is ways that we can try to capture the flag-like events or things to entice new builders specifically focused on the L1 to L2 landscape. And specifically in our case, searching through private transactions is a interesting dimension to the MEV game. And so I do think that in the next 6 months, there's actually a lot of opportunities to potentially compete with the I don't want to say entrenched L1 builders because we have to be their friends, but the L1 builders.
We want people to get involved. What does that look like in terms of hardware requirements? I mean, people generally have an idea of how much money they would have to spend if they want to spin up a node or a validator aside from the staking. What does that look like if I want to sequence or build blocks?
I mean, estimating builder hardware requirements is really interesting. I mean, it's kind of a skill issue at some point. Like, hardware isn't the limiting factor in a lot of cases. It's coming up with novel strategies.
And also just like size.
Yeah, just having size and weight to throw around, honestly. I mean, at that point that you have novel strategies and stuff, you can scale hardware. It does cost something. I think Aztec's looking into potentially like CTF style events where you can guarantee the grand prize should offset your hardware, or retroactive grant styles to ensure that there's end builders potentially interested in building on the L2. I think we're thinking more about it than others because we will be decentralized more than a lot of other people, and we do support out of protocol PBS like that looks very similar to Ethereum's landscape. So I don't think hardware requirements are the limiting factor. I think it's a skill issue.
Nice. I'd really like to see grants like that. That would be awesome. Porter, anything to add?
Yeah, just the phrase like "show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome" is like I think very apropos here. And so like this was part of like building towards the end game, and I think like this is part of what Ethereum alignment should mean is like if you like want this future where like lots of different people are able to participate, you have to design the incentives around that kind of from the beginning. So it's important to get those right.
I think there's also a world where the type of MEV that gets extracted evolves. Like right now, the block builder market is dominated by the like centralized exchange, decentralized exchange ARB, which means you just have to be like an HFT trader to be competitive. If some of that kind of if some of that ARB gets captured at the protocol layer, there's kind of these designs that try and capture that and give it back to the LPs rather than giving it to the proposer or the builder. If that MEV kind of starts to disappear and it returns to more of like a really smart knapsack problem, or figuring out how to like do all sorts of bundle merging and like the more, I guess, algorithm driven MEV extraction, then I think that opens up the tail for the long tail. Like right now, it's mostly just like how many millions of dollars do you have on Binance to like close the ARB with Uniswap, which is not going to ever decentralize, I don't think.
Do you think that L2 blob timing games are better or worse in a world where there's like an excessive backlog of blobs waiting to get in?
Well,
you're never going to miss a slot. Like your blobs will always be full. So you like...
Yeah, I guess there is this nice mechanic where if builders are playing timing games with blobs and excluding a bunch of blobs from blocks, then the base fee of the blob goes to 0. And then the entire blob fee is captured in like a proposer tip. So the amount, like the edge that the proposer has to have over a different, or the builder has to have over a different builder that does include the blobs grows. But yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question.
It doesn't, but that's very interesting.
All right, so I am a privacy maxi. For this reason, we are going to go back to censorship resistance, but we're going to talk about a different flavor of it. We talked about can a sequencer censor me, but there are other forms of censorship resistance. Who here claimed a Celestia or Dimension airdrop? Anyone? Did anyone do it from the US? I know you use the VPN because you got censored geographically. And this is something that can happen for a lot more reasons than an airdrop. So we talk about censorship resistance from the participants of the network, but what about from adversaries outside, whether that is through traffic entropy or other things like that? Is that something that's being looked at either at the base layer or on layer 2s?
I've always thought that there are lots of Web 2 security things that could be brought into Web 3. So like using the Tor browser while participating with, I guess, MetaMask is like maybe not the best example, but these types of things. Something that's like less known about network security is I think some people have heard of like China's Great Firewall, where basically around the whole country they more or less try to control everything that enters and exits through the internet. But the Border Gateway Protocol, which is actually how like the internet connects to each other between major regions, is like very, very centralized, and most countries actually could block off their internet if they like decided to. And so we should be like very careful just from the network security standpoint to make sure that like if people are offline, do they have some sort of like sneaky like Tor has relays because all the entrance nodes can be blocked, and so they're like random at-home people who can set up a Tor relay and just forward transactions for like on their behalf. And so I hope things like that would become a thing in Web3.
It sounds like we should fund Porter to work on some like existential risk research for the crypto industry more broadly. I think it's a good question. I mean, most of the censorship we're seeing on L1 today is related to Tornado Cash transactions, and I think that it's kind of an inevitable world. If a lot of the node operators are operating in the United States, they should comply with U.S. laws, and I don't think anyone's going to tell them not to. So I think it's really an interesting problem of having geographic diversity across the stack. I mean, I would say that like in a truly credibly neutral protocol, you can't really inscribe the jurisdictional preferences of a given place. That would contradict the jurisdictional preferences of a different place. And so it's, a lot of times in the Ethereum ecosystems on node operators, application developers, individual users to kind of worry about those things. And it's unfortunate that we're currently at a place in the ecosystem where like the SEC is preventing me from making hundreds of thousands of dollars on a Celestia airdrop in the sake of investor security. Like that's literally not what's happening here. Like Celestia is a wonderful project, and they specifically.
Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, like thanks, Gary. Like it's just a crazy, sad world we live in right now. On that point specifically.
Yeah, I think this falls into the broad category of things that are probably like the true attack surface for crypto networks. Like we talk a lot about, economic security and if someone controls 33% of Ethereum stake, like that type of stuff. But really, like maybe it's just easier to like turn off the network with like a DOS attack. Like it's kind of the elephant in the room. I think in general, front ends and censorship at the browser level feels like kind of inevitable. And again, you need like decentralized front ends. But I think in general, it seems like on the web, we have kind of solved some of those things. Like Pirate Bay continues to operate despite like the best efforts of the FBI and stuff. So hopefully, like people hosting front ends and different, responses to that type of censorship are easier than the protocol-defined censorship properties that we're trying to preserve.
Yeah, front ends are in trouble. You guys heard him. You're all going to have to trade shitcoins from the terminal. You got to interact with the contract directly.
I do encourage people to consider shipping more locally hosted software, whether it's desktop applications, front ends, RPC nodes, or otherwise. I think I would encourage you to build desktop and local first, and then consider browsers and other things secondarily if you care about censorship resistance.
So we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to ask each of you one more question, which will be, looking forward, what are you most excited about or following most closely in the vein of decentralization, whether it's with your project or just the space in general?
I'm most excited for privacy. So it's not something we're working on at Matter Labs, but I'm so I think it's one of the coolest, most important things to happen on the internet. And so every single privacy project, I'm very interested and very excited for them to do well.
Thank you, Porter. We're flattered. Big fan of yours as well. It's a good question. I think in terms of like L1 censorship resistance, I'm probably most excited about Mike's new inclusion list designs. I think that's probably one of the most meaningful impacts and changes we can make to L1 censorship right now. And honestly, it's not that big of a change, so I'd love to see it prioritized.
Yeah. Thanks, Goober. Inclusion lists, I think, are super cool. There's also kind of this new vein of research that spun out of duality, and Max Resnick has written a lot about this, which is this like multiple concurrent proposers stuff. Davide actually posted an ETH Research post yesterday about multiple concurrent inclusion list constructors, which I think is potentially like all the benefits of multiple concurrent proposers, but without kind of some of the engineering problems that come with proposing full blocks. Like they can all just construct inclusion lists rather than full blocks. So excited to read that. But I think in general, yeah, getting the L1 censorship resistance hardening in place as soon as possible is what I'm most bullish on.
Awesome. How about these guys giving each other flowers, passing down the compliments?
It's rare for me to be on a panel with people I admire so much. So shout out to the Espresso folks for organizing and getting such a good list of people.
Yeah, well, decentralization and censorship resistance really cannot be a reactive thing. So I'm glad we have teams that are proactive about it, building in that direction. I want to say thanks to everyone for listening, and let's give a round of applause to our panelists.